flat rate taxes. And of course, Reagan's great success was tax reform, cutting the top marginal income tax rate more than half. Reagan wasn't as successful on the spending side. He was one of the few presidents who was able to constrain the growth of non-defense spending in order to allocate more resources to defense spending. But what these more prudent fiscal and monetary policies did was create the basis for the most rapid economic growth of the post-war period in the 1980s and the 1990s. Well, about this time, I was a professor leading the quiet life of the academic up at the University of Colorado, believe it or not. And I'd written some books and articles supporting Friedman's monetary ideas. And I got a call from John Anders. And John Anders says, I'm starting this new think tank called the Independence Institute, and you're the only conservative economist I found in Colorado, so you are my first big developer. And he didn't give me a choice. So I started writing issue papers and editorials, first for John Andrews, then for Tom Tancredo, and now for John Caldera. And what I have to tell you is these guys have ruined my life. Thanks a lot. I got appointed to a tax commission which put me at the center of the controversy about Tabor. And by the way, I was attacked by Governor Bill Owens for defending Tabor and criticizing referendum C and D. He wrote an editorial in the Boulder Camera attacking my views. Then I got appointed to a para commission to try to reform para, and Dick Lamb and I spent 6 months fighting each other, and I had to write a minority report about para, and I started getting hate mail. I'm the only professor who gets hate emails. So all I can say for you guys at Independence is thanks a lot, because you really made my life miserable. I joined the Heritage Foundation as a Bradley Scholar and then as an adjunct scholar. And what that did was give me an opportunity to do some serious research on tax and spending limits. And many of you may not know that Milton Friedman was the author of the first state tax and spending limit, Prop 1 in California in the early 70s. And Milton Friedman and Ronald Reagan, who was then governor, traveled around the state of California promoting Prop 1. Prop 1 failed narrowly at the polls, but what it did was set a precedent for all the other state and local tax and spending limits, including our own Tabor Amendment. And it certainly influenced my ideas. I wrote model legislation for the American Legislative Change Council based on Colorado's Tabor Amendment. And then I joined Americans for Prosperity and began working on tax and spending limits in all the states. I have to tell you an interesting story about Milton Friedman and tax and spending limits. We were in Wisconsin, and we were very close to getting a Tabor-type limit through the Wisconsin legislature. We were within a couple votes. But we couldn't get a couple legislators to change their mind. They wanted to use a higher, less stringent limit than inflation and population. So we got a conference call with Milton Friedman. This is like a decade ago. And I explained the problem. We had a couple legislators who didn't want to impose this type of limit. They wanted a less stringent limit. And I expected this sort of mild response. Friedman says, "Don't do that! Whatever you do, don't do that! Use inflation and population growth!" And these legislators were on this conference call, and wow! And now, we failed. We didn't get our votes. We didn't get this through the legislature. But what I learned is Friedman was just as eloquent, just as passionate about tax and spending limits a decade ago as he was back in the early 70s. I also learned something else from Friedman, and that is when you get defeated, as we did, you dust yourself off and you move on. I mean, this is just one battle. We lost one. Well, I'm also indebted to Friedman for my role in tax reform, tax policies. As John Caldera said, in the late 1980s, as a result of Reagan's second tax cut, Colorado was about to get a windfall of over $300 million. And John Andrews and I sat down, we decided it's not appropriate for Colorado taxpayers to pay higher taxes just because of federal tax reform brought in the federal tax base. So our argument was that we should replace Colorado's graduated income tax with a flat rate income tax. And somehow we got the Republican leadership on board on this, and so we were called into, John and I were just talking about this, we were called into the Senate President's office, and they had asked us to calculate what's a revenue neutral flat tax that will generate the same revenue as the old graduated tax. I said 4.25%, and I was spot on. That was exactly the revenue neutral number. Well, the Republican leadership said, well, we don't trust you economists, we're going to set it at 5%, and we would like the Independence Institute to support this. And I looked at John, and he looked at me, and John said, no, we're not going to support a tax increase. We support 4.25%. And I take my hat off to John. You know, think tanks sometimes don't always hold the line, take the high road. But John set independence on the right track in that very decision.
Barry, you know, actually, I also calculated the 4.25%, but I let Barry take it.
Right, sir.
Well, today, as I said, I want to convince you that we face a crisis. We are about to repeat the New Deal and all the mistakes we made in the New Deal. As Friedman predicted, it's in times of crisis that we abandon prudent fiscal policies, monetary policies, and that's exactly what is happening. The Fed should be held responsible for this crisis because what happened is the Fed allowed the money supply to expand too rapidly, bringing interest rates to zero. This creates a housing bubble, and then surprise, when the bubble collapses, now what we see in this last year is the most incredible increase in the money supply we've ever seen since, really, in my lifetime. The Fed should be held accountable for the overextension of credit, for the abuse of leveraged financial instruments. What is happening is that Obama not only wants to give the Fed more control of the money supply, what he wants is the Fed to regulate the whole financial system. What a disaster. Over the past decade, any fiscal discipline that has ever existed is being eroded at both the federal and state level by these policies. And I should tell you, if you don't think there's a crisis, I urge you to look at the Congressional Budget Office projections of what's going to happen to this economy. This was even before Obama's policies. What the Congressional Budget Office projected is that entitlements will absorb larger and larger shares of the federal budget. Government spending will absorb larger and larger shares of the GDP to about 40